Good afternoon. I'm Hillary Wickay-Vyers, and I'm the Communications Director for the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. Thanks for joining us today for our discussion about the Bioethics Commission's newest release, Gray Matters, Topics at the Intersection of Neuroscience, Ethics, and Society. The report was released this morning and can be found on our website at bioethics.gov. A recording of this webinar will also be available on our website in the next 24 hours. Our speakers today are Bioethics Commission members Dr. Anita Allen of the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Nita Farahani of Duke University, Dr. Christine Grady of the National Institutes of Health Clinical Center, and Dr. Lisa M. Lee, Executive Director of the Bioethics Commission. I have a couple of housekeeping items to cover just before we begin. We will take questions at the end of the webinar. Throughout this webinar, you can submit your questions using the chat feature in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. With your question, please include your name and organization if applicable. If you have any technical questions, please submit them to Chairperson in that chat feature. We also encourage you to join the neuroscience conversation on Twitter during and after this webinar using the hashtag BrainI. You can see it in the bottom of this slide. It's all capital BRAIN with a lowercase I at the end. And you can find the Bioethics Commission on Twitter at bioethics.gov. One more plug before we get started. Look for more information in the coming weeks on a Gray Matters symposium that will take place at Georgetown University on April 27. The symposium will feature an opening lecture by Commission member Dr. Stephen Hauser, as well as a panel of presentations on cognitive enhancement, consent capacity, and neuroscience and the legal system. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Lisa M. Lee. Lisa?
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for those of you on the West Coast. We're delighted to have you join us so we can, myself and my colleagues from the Commission can inform you a bit about our two-volume report, Gray Matters. Today we've released Volume 2 of that, and we're very excited to talk with you about the Commission's recommendations. Next slide. For those of you unfamiliar with the Commission, the Presidential Bioethics Commission we are chaired by Dr. Amy Gutman, who is a political philosopher by trade, and we are vice chaired by Dr. James Wagner, who is an engineer. We have representatives on our group, lots of different disciplines and expertise, including nursing, medicine, philosophy, theology, basic science, and the law. The President charged this group, next slide, in July of 2013 to identify proactively a set of core ethical standards, both to guide neuroscience research and to address some of the ethical dilemmas that may be raised by the application of neuroscience research findings. This is the President's acknowledgement that ethics is an extremely important part of modern neuroscience. And this group, as I mentioned earlier, the multidisciplinary views, came together to talk about what that set of core ethical standards should be. Next slide. In an effort for us of us to release a report quickly and early on into the BRAIN initiative, the Bioethics Commission felt very strongly about early and explicit integration of ethics throughout neuroscience research. They also thought it was critically important that sufficient resources be dedicated to encourage and evaluate this integration of ethics and neuroscience. Our first volume of this report came out in May of 2014, where the strongest recommendation was to integrate early and explicitly. In fact, our hashtag BrainI is an effort to integrate our efforts of ethics into neuroscience, as that BRAIN initiative hashtag is one where an entire conversation around brain and neuroscience is happening. So we encourage you to use that hashtag today. This morning, as Hillary said, we released our second volume of Gray Matters. This volume really is looking at some of the topics at the intersection of neuroscience, ethics, and society, the implications of the work that neuroscience does. The inputs to this to this report include many different inputs. We as a commission are a public body, and we do all of our work in the public. And as a result of that, we had 9 related public meetings between 2011 and 2015. As you'll note, we started talking about neuroscience and ethics before the President gave us the charge. This is because it's clearly an interest in bioethics and an incredibly important topic as modern neuroscience moves forward. We also, during those 9 meetings, had over 60 experts in a variety of fields, including one similar to our expertise, but also personal stories and other affected communities who came to provide input to the Commission for its deliberations. We also published a request for information in the Federal Register in January and received over 30 very thoughtful and well-directed responses that also gave us input for the report and for our deliberations. We consulted, as I mentioned, with experts in science, ethics, medicine, philosophy, etc., as well as probably many of you on this call, public and private funders of the BRAIN Initiative. Next slide. We know, firstly, that neuroscience is a rapidly growing multidisciplinary field, and it encompasses many scientific and ethical issues. As we went through our deliberations, it was clear that many of these ethical issues are not unique to neuroscience per se. They pervade science in general. But some of the ethical issues are expressed in neuroscience in sharper relief, and it's those that we were particularly interested in looking at. We know more than 1 billion individuals globally and millions of people in the U.S. suffer from neurologic disorders, with estimated costs both to the health system as well as productivity of over $760 billion a year in the U.S. alone. And as our population ages, the prevalence of age-related neurologic disorders, including things like neurodegenerative diseases and Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, etc., that those will increase. The burden of those diseases is dramatic. Historically, clinicians struggled to diagnose and treat these kinds of disorders. Before the 70s, for example, clinical neuroscience really focused on managing a patient's symptoms, relating patient symptoms with tissue changes after death, and my goodness, we've come a long way since then. Neuroscience is opening doors for diagnosis, treatment, and even cures of some of these devastating conditions. With these open doors, however, comes controversy, and the Bioethics Commission focused on 3 of the most ethically controversial issues related to this field of neuroscience. These controversial topics include cognitive enhancement, consent capacity, and neuroscience in the legal system. These topics sit at the center of both scholarly debate as well as media and public debate and dialogue around these topics. Hype and misinformation permeate this conversation about neuroscience, about brain, about who we are. And this hype and misinformation can do 3 things that we're concerned about. 1, mislead the public. If one looks just at headlines related to neuroscience, it is astonishing the things we've supposedly accomplished in the last 10 years. It also can lead to misdirected resources, and this is we see this with hype and overpromising of results, too early of adoption of certain kinds of technologies. Finally, we are concerned that this kind of hype and misinformation can instill misplaced fears. So what the Bioethics Commission really aimed to do here was to clear a path that will allow productive discourse on the ethical progress of neuroscience research. The Bioethics Commission is committed to this productive discourse for the best application and promise of neuroscience. At this point, what we'll do is take each of these topics individually, and I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Anita Allen, who will talk with us about cognitive enhancement and beyond. Dr. Allen?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. Good afternoon, everybody. It pleases me greatly to be here to talk about a really important section of our new Gray Matters Report, Volume 2, and that is the section that deals with cognitive enhancement and beyond. For more than a decade, there's been a very, very lively debate among philosophers, ethicists, and bioethicists about what's been commonly referred to as cognitive enhancement. Cognitive enhancement, very, very loosely, refers to any kind of medication or procedure or other measure that makes our thinking and our reasoning processes better. Now, the ongoing scholarly debate has traditionally focused on improving the cognition of otherwise healthy individuals. So, for example, could we improve the cognition of college students by giving them stimulant drugs like Adderall or Ritalin? There are controversies that surround the idea of making otherwise healthy people even better in this way, better than what would be typically regarded as average or normal. So the debate has raged on. What the Commission decided to do was to broaden the conversation beyond the topic of cognitive enhancement in healthy people and to think about ways in which even people who are not healthy might benefit from or be harmed by enhancements or by modification. And so we decided to use the term neuromodification to refer to the wider array of mechanisms of brain and nervous system changes that might be applicable not just to healthy people but also to people with illnesses and injuries. So, neuromodification refers not only to novel neurotechnologies, but also to common daily conditions and behaviors that can impact the brain, such as nutrition. The purposes behind neuromodification can be any one of these three. It could be to maintain or improve the neural health and cognitive function within the typical or statistically normal range. It could be used to treat a deficiency, an injury, an impairment, or a disorder in order to achieve or restore a typical statistically normal functioning. And finally, it can be used, and where it's, I think, the most controversial, can be used to expand or augment function above typical or normal ranges. In thinking about the topic of neural modification, our commission came up with 5 recommendations that we think ought to be acknowledged as important in relation to the future of not just the BRAIN Initiative, but to neuroscience in general. One of our recommendations, recommendation number 1, is that in thinking about moving forward, that we as a society prioritize existing strategies to maintain and improve health. So, for example, before we think about cycle surgeries and fancy pharmaceuticals, let's first think about how a healthy diet full of minerally rich and vitamin-rich foods could help to improve cognitive function. Let's think about sleep and exercise. It's well known that for conditions like headaches and seizures, that actually a good night's sleep can be a great, great boon. Let's think about things like lead paint abatement that so adversely affects, when it's not accomplished, young children in our cities. And how about high-quality educational opportunities that can educate both school children but also college students and professionals about the importance of the preconditions of neural health. And finally, we need to focus on how we can strategize around environmental health and safety to make sure that we have toxin-free workplaces and housing for all people. Next slide. Once we have in place a good set of prioritized strategies around improving neural health that don't require us to move into new and expensive technologies, but just to do the basics, at that point we need to think about how we can prioritize the treatment of neurological disorders. And so we are recommending that funders prioritize research that can actually improve health and alleviate suffering. There are many, many conditions, including mental illnesses, but also Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and other conditions that we need to find a cure for. We need to find ways to improve the public health to either eradicate these conditions or to come up with effective treatments and hopefully cures. And so we'd like research to be prioritized that will ease the burdens on families and individuals and the public from chronically problematic conditions such as the ones I've named. But also we need research that will help us to better understand the benefits and the risk and the long-term effects of the specific interventions that are proposed or adopted. Next slide. Then, moving beyond strategies based on our low-tech measures and then moving beyond prioritizing certain kinds of research, we also want to have a very careful study take place of novel neural modifications that could be adopted to augment or enhance neural function. As mentioned earlier, probably one of the most controversial type of neural modifier is that's aimed at not just making people healthy or normal, but making people better than that. The smart pill, better than smart, better than healthy. And here we have to worry a lot about and understand better the prevalence of conditions and the prevalence of interventions that might be regarded as neural modifications. What are their benefits to society and to individuals? What are the risks to society, to culture, of adopting a world in which we can readily turn to medications or surgeries that will improve us beyond what traditionally has been understood as normal and healthy. And finally, we really want to find ways to ensure that we can properly characterize and to guide the ethical use of interventions that might be augmenting and enhancing our neural capacities and functions. Next slide. Our fourth recommendation is that we ensure equitable access to novel neural modifiers, augment or enhance neural function. And this is particularly important because if our society is going to rely upon research and scholarship and learning, much of which will have been publicly financed and supported, we want to make sure that everybody, not just the wealthy, but people of all economic classes, all demographic groups, can have access to the benefits of research and advancements. So we want to recommend that policymakers and other stakeholders ensure equitable access to novel neural modifiers. We want to make sure that these modifiers that are made available, that could be made available, are beneficial to those whom they're targeted at, that they're safe, that they're effective, and that they're also morally acceptable. We don't want access to or the availability of a neural modifier to exacerbate the existing social and economic inequalities. If it's going to be something that's going to make humankind smarter, everybody should have an access to becoming smarter. Finally, we want to recommend that we create guidance, that society create guidance about the use of neural modifiers. How can they be used? So we want to recommend that professional organizations and other expert groups develop guidance for clinicians to assist them in responding to requests for example, prescription medications that would lead to some kind of. And it's going to be up to groups of all sorts, whether they're public or private groups, to mobilize themselves to develop important guidelines that can be used by doctors, nurses, researchers who may have also some. Make sure everybody who's in a position to offer or to use prescription medications or surgeries or other mechanisms, that they do so in accordance with guidelines that are ethically well-grounded. We also, in addition to just calling for guidance from other organizations, we also do make a direct recommendation ourselves, and we directly recommend that clinicians at this point should not prescribe medications with uncertain benefits and risk to augment neural function in children and adolescents especially who do not have neurological disorders. It's a concern that already some clinicians may be providing medications, again, such as stimulants, to children and adolescents just for the purpose of making them more successful testers. And we are recommending that no such prescriptions be offered until we understand better, and unless we understand better the benefits and risk of so doing. So that in brief are the 5 recommendations we make in the area of cognitive enhancement and beyond. And I now turn over to Christine Grady, Dr. Christine Grady, to talk about the next topic.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you, Lisa, and thank you to all the people that are on the webinar. I'm going to talk about capacity and consent and I want to reiterate something that Dr. Lee said about the burden of neurological disorders, mental illnesses, brain and nervous system injuries, and age-related cognitive decline. The burden is enormous, and it's growing. It's likely that in our lifetime, all of us will be affected by or have a loved one who is affected by a neurological disorder or a psychiatric condition or a decline in brain or nervous system function. And there's a desperate need, actually, for interventions to better prevent, diagnose, or treat these often devastating disorders, as Dr. Allen just described, and a critical need for continued research to find effective and safe interventions. At the same time, many of these conditions have the potential to impair the affected person's capacity to understand or to process information, to deliberate, or to make decisions. And these are the kinds of capacities that are needed to be able to consent to research and to healthcare interventions as well. Scientific progress to prevent, diagnose, treat, and alleviate the disorders requires research with human participants. One of the bedrocks of human participant protection in research is informed consent. Thus, we're faced with a very challenging tension between the need for rigorous research on diseases and conditions that might impair the capacity to consent and the need to protect the potentially very vulnerable individuals in these studies who may have impaired consent capacity. So the principal challenge is how to responsibly include individuals with impaired consent capacity or those with capacities that fluctuate or are in question. Responsible inclusion of people who can't consent follows the ethical principles that guide the conduct of research, including the principle of respect for persons, which is respect both for the capacities and decisions of those who can make autonomous decisions, as well as respect for those whose decision-making capacities are absent or impaired. A second important principle, beneficence, requires attention to the risks and benefits not only of individual participants of research, but also the significant public benefits of discovering ways to prevent and treat neurological and psychiatric disorders. And the principle of justice helps us think about the terms of fair distribution of the benefits of research, which necessitates fair inclusion of persons in research. So persons with the capacity, with consent capacity, that is impaired, fluctuating, or in question, can be responsibly included in research when there are adequate protections in place. The challenges of how to responsibly include individuals with impaired or questionable consent capacity are actually not new ones. Many previous national level advisory bodies have struggled with these issues. Despite previous recommendations, the federal regulations currently do not specifically address persons with impaired consent capacity or specify additional safeguards, although many protections are included in the regulations as written. The Commission acknowledges that the critical importance of research on neurological and psychiatric and other disorders that have the potential to impair consent capacity, also the importance of clarifying persistent questions about how to responsibly include individuals with impaired consent capacity, and the importance of filling important gaps in our current state of knowledge. And in this regard, the Commission made 4 recommendations. The first one you see on this slide, recommendation number 6, the Commission recommended that participants with impaired consent capacity be responsibly included in neuroscience research. Responsible inclusion can both promote progress aimed at understanding and ameliorating neurological, psychiatric, and other disorders that impair consent capacity, and also allow neuroscience research with the potential to benefit individuals with those conditions or these conditions. So what does responsible inclusion entail? In addition to the usual requirements of valid and valuable project with careful analysis of risk-benefit and fairness and selection criteria, responsible inclusion might involve rigorous assessment of consent capacity, methods of disclosing information in the consent process that accommodate particular needs, methods of respecting assent and dissent, and clear and respectful methods of obtaining the permission of a legally authorized representative when indicated. In addition, the use of research advance directives, independent monitoring, and other initiatives to reduce stigma can provide protections. But more can be learned about the appropriate safeguards under different circumstances. And so in the next slide, you see recommendation number 7, which is that the Commission recommends that funders of research support both empirical and conceptual research to address knowledge gaps about impaired consent capacity. We recognize that much has been accomplished actually in understanding the capacity to consent and in developing tools to assess consent capacity and safeguards as described above. But much remains to be done. And we recognized also that neuroscience research itself could provide tools to refine our understanding of and assessment of decision-making capacities, including consent capacity, and the underlying neurological and cognitive correlates. Continued research on the concept of various capacities, brain function and decision-making, assessment tools for capacity, and current policies and practices could also serve to improve the responsible inclusion of persons with impaired capacity in research, and to provide respectful and appropriate healthcare interventions in the clinic as well. Unfortunately, misunderstanding and lack of awareness contribute to perceptions and practices that stigmatize certain groups. On the next slide, recommendation number 8 is to engage stakeholders to address stigma associated with impaired capacity assessment. And importantly, funders and researchers should engage stakeholders to build understanding of consent capacity and associated diagnoses. Stakeholders must include members of affected communities, as well as researchers, healthcare providers, and others that are involved in working with persons with affected. In order to build understanding of the consent capacity and to identify and prevent stigmatizing assumptions and practices. And finally, and very importantly in the next slide, recommendation number 9, the Commission recommends that state legislatures and federal regulatory bodies establish clear requirements for those who can serve as legally authorized representatives for individuals with impaired consent capacity in order to support their responsible inclusion in research. Current regulations allow the inclusion of persons who cannot consent for themselves with the permission of a legally authorized representative, and state laws dictate who can serve as a legally authorized representative and what decisions such a person can make. However, state laws vary. Most state laws recognize legally authorized representatives who have been previously appointed by the person, him or herself, as healthcare proxy, and also recognize the individual's next of kin, usually listed in a hierarchical order in state laws. Most state laws describe legally authorized representatives' authority over medical decisions, but rarely specify what authority legally authorized representatives have with respect to research decisions. So uncertainty persists over whether and under what circumstances state laws specific to medical decisions extend to research decisions. And the Commission believes that clearer requirements and procedures would facilitate responsible inclusion of those without the capacity to consent themselves. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nita Farahani, who will talk about neuroscience and the legal system. Nita, are you there?
Nita,
Oh,
might need to take your
My apologies. So I'll start over. So I want to thank Drs. Grady, Allen, Lee, and others on the call for being here. And as we turn to the issue of neuroscience in the legal system, this tends to be one of the areas that there is a significant amount of media attention to and a significant amount of scholarly attention to as well. And that it makes sense, of course, because neuroscience tends to offer us at this point at least a better understanding of human behavior, one that we've long been searching for in other venues, whether it's in psychology or psychiatry or ordinary genetics and biology. And because of the promise that it offers for improved understanding of human behavior, what we see is that it has great potential and also great peril in its use in legal settings and policymaking settings. So let me just start by saying there is great promise from neuroscience, whether it's by improving policymaking, increasing our accuracy in things like eyewitness detection, or decreasing errors that already exist within the legal system. And because of that, it has already been used in quite a few contexts. You can see in this chart here at the bottom that there has been an increase from 2005 to 2012 year over year of criminal defendants coming into the criminal justice system, into criminal courtrooms, arguing something like, my brain made me do it. The basic idea is that some sort of neurological understanding of an abnormality or a difference or atypicality in their brain helps to explain why they did the thing that they did. And as a result, what they're arguing for is a reduction in their punishment. You can see there's three different colors of the charts there, and all of them include simply felony offenses. So the most serious offenses are the types of offenses that a criminal defendant would have to commit before they would invest the resources, invest the time, and invest the kind of defense that would say, my brain made me do it. And yet it's for more than just capital cases where the death penalty is on the line, which would be a focus on mitigating punishment. Instead, what we see is that already criminal defendants and defense attorneys are trying to challenge, for example, issues of mental state, whether or not they had the necessary premeditation or deliberation to commit a crime, whether they had, loosely speaking, the kind of free will necessary to hold them responsible for a crime. And while this trend has been increasing, what we see is that at the same time, there's a great deal of hype that accompanies it as well, and a lot of concern that accompanies it as well. So a number of studies have been done that look at, for example, what the impact of introducing this kind of evidence is on jurors and whether it's unduly prejudicial. All of this activity that's been happening both in policymaking settings and the incorporation of neuroscience, as well as in legal settings, both by criminal defendants as well as in areas of, for example, tort law or civil cases where a person tries to establish pain or other types of issues, led us to make a series of recommendations that focus primarily around what leadership at the executive level could offer for this introduction of neuroscience in the legal system. Next slide, please. So in a series of 4 recommendations, what you'll see is that our focus in this area is primarily to encourage further study and education and decreased hype on the use of neuroscience in the legal system. One of the primary claims that you hear by neuroscientists, philosophers, in the media tends to be that neuroscience has undone the legal system, that it has disproved the capacity for responsibility. What we believe as a commission is that while neuroscience can help guide normative assessments in areas like policymaking and law, it can't change the fundamental normative questions that the legal system is seeking to answer. Instead, those are questions that we as a society have to come to have answers to, that we have to deliberate upon in a democratic way, and neuroscience, just like any other science, can help inform that. So In support of that, we recommend that we should expand and promote the educational tools to aid understanding and use of neuroscience within the legal system. In particular, it's incredibly helpful for judges, for jurors, for attorneys, for members of the public, and for policymakers to understand the breadth and depth to which neuroscience is already being used in the legal setting, but then to also understand what that neuroscience really says, what the value of the neuroscience is, how much information it can actually provide, or how little information it can actually provide. Next slide, please. Because of that, we also recommend that there be funding on research on the intersection of neuroscience and the legal system, particularly when you're talking about criminal law where an individual's liberty is at stake. It's particularly problematic to introduce neuroscience ahead of its success or ahead of its utility. And as a result, it's very important that we increase our understanding of what's happening in that capacity, whether it's in the criminal justice system where liberty is at stake, or in the policy-making arena where significant questions of law and policy that can affect a significant number of people are at stake. So we recommend a particular focus in this area of funding. Next slide, please. This is our next recommendation is a recommendation that you have heard echoed throughout our report. And I can't overstress its importance in the context of neuroscience and the legal system. I have regularly read stories or had reporters call me up to ask me about cases in which an individual has introduced some sort of neurological abnormality, and their question is always, doesn't this prove that their brain made them do it, that the tumor made them do it, that the lack of the area in their frontal lobe made them do it? And the problem is that a lot of that information is merely equivocal. It doesn't answer for us, for example, what a person's past mental state was at the time they committed a crime. It doesn't tell us what their motivation was for committing the crime. It may help us understand one of the contributors to their behavior, but it doesn't give us a comprehensive answer. As a result, the kinds of unfounded conclusions that one might draw from early cognitive neuroscience is important to avoid. And it's important to avoid because having overstated neuroscience early on can lead to a rejection in the science. It can undermine the credibility of continued research. It's valuable to step back and understand exactly what can we learn from neuroscience today. How does it bear on questions of responsibility and behavior? And how can we learn about new ways to do research to better have a grasp on that in the future? Next slide, please. The next and last recommendation in this area is the importance of having participation in the legal decision-making process and policy development by neuroscientists and other scientists. Oftentimes, scientists may not wish to engage with policymaking or with the media or with legal decision makers for fear that doing so would support the use of the science in those contexts when they think that it isn't ready yet to do so. But that voice is a very important voice to have in the conversation, and it's a voice that's largely missing today. It's more easily possible to find an expert who is willing to overhype or overstate the science than it is to find responsible scientists willing to engage in the dialogue, willing to talk about how equivocal some of the science may be or the limitations on its use in particular contexts. As a result, we strongly call for neuroscientists and scientists to participate more actively in the process to better inform decision making by policymakers, to improve their ability to translate the science by giving them support to do so in order to have a better long-term outcome of the use of and incorporation of neuroscience into the legal and policymaking process. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lee to talk about some of the overarching recommendations.
Terrific. Thank you all so much for your excellent presentation of the specific issues that the Bioethics Commission took up. I think you'll see that there are some ethical themes here across these three topics. Justice, for example, and stigma are two that continue to be expressed in higher relief. Justice, whether it's just access to cognitive enhancers or use of use of neuroscience in the courtroom, or justly distributing burdens and benefits of research. Stigma, in the sense that there is a great deal to consider around the neurological and psychological disorders, or around capacity to consent and the stigma associated with that. Or stigma associated with persons involved in criminal or civil cases who've had their brains examined by legal teams, for example. These themes and others led the Bioethics Commission to recommend in Volume 1 of this report early and explicit integration of ethics and neuroscience, so we can achieve the great promise that modern neuroscience clearly holds. In Gray Matters 2, this version, many of the recommendations we made were for additional research and education. This has led the Commission to its last recommendation, which is about funding, that Brain Initiative funders should establish multidisciplinary efforts to support neuroscience and ethics research and education. This initiative, these initiatives from the Brain Initiative writ large should establish organized, independent, multidisciplinary efforts to support neuroscience and ethics research, education, and, as I mentioned earlier, to include the activities recommended in this report. The Commission did not recommend a specific model of this type of organized, independent, multidisciplinary effort. A couple of examples are included in the report. There are many ways to do this besides a brick and mortar building and people inside that building, but lots of ways to virtually collaborate. The point here is really that if we are going to prioritize integration of ethics and neuroscience, it is something that must be funded. Next slide. We hope that you will join the conversation about neuroscience and ethics starting today at the hashtag BrainEye, and anytime with us at bioethics.gov. We will now turn things back to the moderator, who will begin with questions. Hillary?
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks very much to all of our presenters. Let's open it up for some questions, and as a reminder, you can submit your questions using the chat feature in the lower portion of your screen. And with your question, if you would please include your name and organization if applicable. So our first question I am going to pitch to Dr. Allen, as it is about neural modifiers. And it comes from Walter Koroshetz, and he writes and questions, the Commission's concerns for use of neural modifiers in the in medicine seem clear. Were there specific concerns that the Commission highlighted regarding the use of neural modifiers to treat disease?
Hello. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, good. Thank you. So if I understand, Walter's question is about whether we specifically addressed neuro modifiers in relationship to addressing disease. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, great. Yes, the Commission thought a lot and deliberated a lot about the use of neural modification to address disease, not only diseases but also injuries that have comparable effects. And we are extremely happy to have recommended that continuing study and that go into this area, and that researchers be benefited with additional funding from private and public resources to enable us to better understand what it would take to prevent and to cure and to treat disease and injuries. At the same time, we did have a lot of conversation about whether neural modifiers could be used or should be used in relationship to things like aviation, military readiness, and academics and sports. And I think that there we just believe that the ethics of all of these have to be considered on a case-by-case basis in context. We don't categorically say that using neural modifiers is always good in relationship to addressing disease and always bad in other contexts, but rather we recommend that we look at each of these proposals one by one and decide whether or not in a particular context there are the costs and benefits and the virtues and vices assigned to or attached to the particular use can pass ethical muster.
Thanks very much. Our next question is for Professor Farhani from Professor James Giordano of Georgetown University Medical Center. And he asks, do you see an ethical imperative to address extant standards of admissibility of evidence, for example, Daubert and other aspects of CFE, to better align with the ways that neuroscience can and should be utilized within the legal system? Dr. Farahani.
Thanks, Jim, for that question. That's a really interesting question. I'd say in the short term, probably not. That is that rules of evidence, like many of the other standards that we have in law, have survived many different kinds of neuroscience many different kinds of science being introduced into the system. But I take the question to be a kind of deeper question about how can neuroscience challenge some of the standards, whether they are standards of admissibility of evidence or questions about things like the reasonable person standard that we use throughout law. And there I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done, which is neuroscience can help us rethink our standards and see where we got things right and where we got things wrong. And it can help inform our normative decision making about when we draw a line about when kinds of evidence can be admitted into the courtroom, or how we define what the ordinary capacities of an individual are.
Great, thank you. And our next question is for Dr. Christine Grady. And the question is, how do you advise that individuals with impaired capacity be included in research?
Well, thank you for the question. I think the important starting principle is that they should be included. They should be included in ways that are responsible, and that means including safeguards to protect them from the kinds of things that we worry about when people are included in research. So responsible inclusion means making sure we do research that's valuable in terms of answering questions that are relevant to people who have impaired consent capacity, but also using methods for understanding how to obtain and respect assent and dissent, how to include or follow the directions of legally authorized representatives that are acting in the interests of the persons they're representing, and also other means of including persons who have maybe diminished capacity but not absent capacity to the extent possible in the decisions that are being made, and constantly reassessing their ability to be involved.
Great, thanks for that. Our next question is for Dr. Allen, and it comes from Eliza Strickland of IEEE Spectrum. And she asks, you said there's a concern that clinicians are already prescribing stimulants to people without neurological disorders in order to improve their performance on tests. Did you find any evidence that clinicians are being asked to provide non-pharmaceutical treatments such as TDCS and TMS?
Wow, good. So I want to be a little bit modest here in saying that the Commission did not do its own empirical research to measure the extent to which the prevalence, for example, of using medications or using any kind of surgical intervention or any other kind of measure. So we relied a lot on the testimony of experts who came to speak to us. So the answer, I guess the strict answer to the question is no. But I do want to say that we did hear a lot of concerns about actual uses of drugs, especially the kinds of readily available pharmaceuticals such as the Ritalins and the Adderalls. And even we heard a little bit about concerns about using drugs like Provigil, which can enhance alertness in whether in aviation or military or elsewhere. And so we did hear these concerns. I don't think we heard as much about non-medical or non-pharmaceutical kind of interventions, but I think the issues there are the same. We need to understand the prevalence. We need to understand better the purposes. We need to understand better the costs and benefits and the values that might be impacted by the use of any such measures.
Hillary, this is Lisa. Can I just make a comment about that question?
Absolutely.
Great, thanks. I think one of the very important things the Commission recommended is that we get accurate information about prevalence and of the use of these kinds of neuromodification techniques for cognitive enhancement. We know that one can order over the internet, for example, the equipment one needs, or even already prepared headsets for some of these transcranial manipulations of the brain. So it's not necessary to have a healthcare provider's prescription for those, but we know it's happening. We know you can look that up easily and figure that out. The other, but we don't have a good sense of the extent to which that's happening, nor do we know very much about the extent of the benefits in terms of its purported purpose, which is to improve cognitive ability. So one of the key pieces in terms of hype and in terms of misinformation is really to examine clearly and in a scientifically responsible way, what is the prevalence? How many people are using these devices, and what are the results of their use? Are they getting what they've been promised? In addition to that, for the pharmaceutical piece, it's very difficult to find the right population to sample to get an accurate measure of prevalence. Most of the prevalence estimates we have now are from asking college students, for example, about their use of these pharmaceuticals for cognitive enhancement. We guess that that's higher in college students who are very concerned with their intellectual prowess and performance, and it's just very difficult to get accurate estimates of how much these things are being used. All that said, it's likely that use will increase as the number of possible either pharmaceuticals or other kinds of mechanisms exist or are presented to folks to use. So it is a critical question, one that we hope persons and organizations in the Brain Initiative and other neuroscientists will take up and help us clarify.
Great, thanks, Lisa. And this next question is for Dr. Grady, and it comes from Susan Adams. Dr. Grady, does the Commission endorse then the production of standard information for LARs about their responsibilities in providing permission for individuals who lack capacity for consent?
Let me make sure I understand. Thank you for the question, but let me make sure I understand it. Standard information for LARs in doing what?
in providing their permission for individuals who lack the capacity for consent.
Okay, so that's a great question. I think the Commission did not say anything specifically about that, other than the idea that we need clearer guidance on who can serve as an LAR and clearer rules about how how across different states who can serve as an LAR and what they can do, what kinds of authority they have over research decision making. I think there is some understanding that an LAR should receive the same kind of information that a person who has the capacity to consent should receive when they're trying to make a decision about whether or not to enroll somebody in research. So all of the information that's necessary to make an informed and enlightened decision about enrollment.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to have Lisa start doing possibly a round robin on this next question because I think everybody can chime in on it. But Lisa, why don't you kick it off? The question is, why did the Commission focus on these three issues, consent, capacity, cognitive enhancement, and neuroscience in the legal system? Are these the only areas of concern in neuroscience?
That's a great question, and we've anticipated that this might be something all of you are interested in. In fact, these aren't the only issues. There are, all of you know who work in neuroscience, there are a multitude of issues. We could go on for days just listing them. But I think that the sense from the Commission was that if we could clear a path forward for these three very controversial issues, so we could think ethically about a way forward, a clear way forward on these issues that are contentious and or controversial, that we could begin to model some deliberative processes to deal with any of the ethical issues that come up from advances in neuroscience. So I'll hand that back to one of the commission members. Perhaps, Nita, you can give your perspective on why the commission chose those 3 topics.
Sure. I think that's a nice framing of why we chose those topics. I'd also say that these 3 topics are ones that have already arrived. We're already grappling with them. For example, just looking at that chart on the increasing use of neuroscience in the legal system, that's just one context in which it's increasing and increasing relatively rapidly. So getting out ahead of those issues, or really concurrently with those issues, we thought was essential, and then likewise providing a scaffold to be able to look at the many different emerging issues that will arise over time. And I'll turn that over to...
Hi. If I could just add the other Anita. It's a great question. It's a great question. If you open any applied ethics textbook or any bioethics textbook today, what you'll find is the topic of cognitive enhancements being discussed and debated on those pages. A lot of scholars, a lot of researchers are very, very interested in this particular aspect of biomedical innovation. What will it mean for our society, for our culture, for our moral culture, once it's possible to change people's basic way of thinking and feeling and reasoning? And I think that's one of the reasons why the Commission took up the topic of cognitive enhancement and moved it beyond, because it is one of those topics that, as Dr. Farahani said, it's already arrived and it's there on the pages of our scholarship. And the Commission, I think, could not have otherwise, but then included this topic among those that it discussed. And I think we made some real headway in asking that we just broaden the topic from how can normal people be made better into the topic of how can people with illnesses and people at risk for illnesses, people who've been injured in war or been injured in car accidents, how can they be helped by the fruits of neuroscience?
And I can add to that too. I think with respect to, just as Dr. Allen said, if you open any textbook, if you walk into any research facility or any healthcare facility for that matter, or sit on an IRB or try to struggle with how to do research, you know that the issue of how to responsibly include people who cannot or who might not have the capacity to consent is right at the center of all of those discussions. And although lots of work has been done in terms of trying to understand capacity, it's still not a settled area, and there's a lot that still needs to be done. And I think, as for all the reasons that we heard early on, the number of people who are going to have at least a question about their capacity in the research and healthcare environments that we work in is just going to increase. And so getting better systems and understanding doing more research to understand the issues better methods for addressing it is really all.
Thank you all very much. I want to thank our speakers today. They are Bioethics Commission members Dr. Allen, Dr. Anita Allen, Dr. Nita Farahani, and Dr. Christine Grady, and Executive Director of the Bioethics Commission, Dr. Lisa M. Lee. Thanks for joining us today. Gray Matters is available on bioethics.gov, and a recording of this webinar will also be available on our website within the next 24 hours. Thanks again, and have a great day.